In the fog-veiled heart of Highgate Cemetery, a woman kneels beside an unmarked grave, clutching a silver bell, her final words lost to silence. But for Sherlock Holmes, this death is not a puzzle. It is a mirror. Welcome to a forgotten chapter, The Shadow of Highgate, a haunting tale of memory, mystery, and the one case Holmes never dared to publish. If you enjoy immersive storytelling and classic detective fiction, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because some echoes are meant to be heard. It was not until many years after the death of Sherlock Holmes at his Sussex cottage that I dared to revisit the pages of a case which, until now, has remained sealed within the recesses of my private journals. Not for lack of intrigue or deduction, but because the events surrounding it brushed too closely upon matters both personal and perilous, beyond the reach of public scrutiny or even, perhaps, justice. It was Holmes himself who entreated me, "Let that one sleep, Watson. The world is not yet prepared for such truths." And yet time, that great unwinder of secrets, permits me now to tell the tale of Lady Frances Carroway, and the bell that tolled too soon. It began, as so many of our stranger cases did, with a letter. The hour was barely past 8 when Mrs. Hudson announced its arrival at Baker Street, handing Holmes a black envelope bearing no seal, only his name as Holmes, scrawled in narrow, slanting script. I was stirring my tea when he slid it open with the precision of a surgeon, withdrew the single folded page, and stared. He read it twice without comment. Then, as was his wont when arrested by some intellectual thunderclap, he handed it to me wordlessly and turned to the fire. The message was short and chilling. "You of all men will know this was no suicide, or you never truly knew yourself." There was no signature, no address, no clue to its provenance, save a faint, earthy stain in one corner and the smell of cold stone. "Well," I said after a moment, lowering the paper, "this is either an impertinent hoax or a challenge of the first order." Holmes stood at the hearth, arms folded, his eyes half closed in thought. "It is neither, Watson. It is a summons, and we shall answer it. Do you recognize the handwriting?" He shook his head. "No, but I recognize the weight behind it. There is a tone of intimate familiarity, of someone who believes themselves qualified to judge me." He turned, his eyes sharp now. "Watson, have you the Times?" I handed him the paper, and within moments he found what he sought. He tapped an article on the inside column of page 7. "Tragedy at Highgate. Death of Lady Frances Carroway." The body of Lady Frances Carroway, daughter of the late Viscount Carroway, was discovered yesterday morning at Highgate Cemetery. Witnesses report she was found kneeling beside an unmarked grave in the North Circle, dressed entirely in white and holding a small silver bell. Scotland Yard has ruled the death a suicide, citing a history of melancholia. The family has declined to comment. Holmes placed the paper down with a curious softness, as though the newsprint itself were a fragile thing. "Lady Frances Carroway," he murmured. "A ghost returned to life only to die again, and beside a nameless grave, no less. This is no ordinary suicide, Watson. You knew her?" "Barely. I met her once, years ago. An intensely perceptive young woman, too intelligent for her station. Her mind was like a lantern left in a fog. She saw too much and too dimly for her own peace." "And the bell?" "That," Holmes said, eyes glinting, "is what we shall discover. Dress warmly. We go to Highgate." And with that, the great detective took down his coat and cane, the black envelope tucked into his pocket like a calling card from some unearthly client. I confess I followed with a strange sense of foreboding, for I had seen many cases grip Holmes's attention, but never one that disturbed him from the outset. He paused at the door and looked back at the hearth, the flames dancing quietly beneath the grate. "Watson," he said softly, "there are crimes that wound the soul more than the law. Let us hope this is not one of them." The morning was bitter, gray, and steeped in a chill that bit through the bones, though no frost yet lay upon the ground. As our handsome carriage wound its way northwards through the damp streets of London, Holmes sat beside me in complete silence, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded, but flickering with that curious interior light which marked his mind at full exertion. When we arrived at Highgate Cemetery, the sky had descended into a heavy mist, the kind that seems not to fall but to rise, as if exhaled from the graves themselves. The sprawling necropolis loomed before us. Twisting paths, tilting tombstones, and a quiet that pressed upon the senses like cloth upon a corpse. We made our way through the North Circle, Holmes navigating by memory as though he had once studied a map of the dead. Presently we reached the spot, a narrow plot set apart from the grand mausoleums, bordered by two leaning cypresses. The ground was still damp where it had been disturbed, and there, at the base of a weather-worn stone, lay a wilted wreath of lilies. Holmes knelt, examining the soil with his magnifying lens. I stood back, casting a wary eye over the graves nearby. No name had been etched upon the stone. Only the date, June 1847. "This is it," Holmes murmured. "Here she came, not to die, but to send a message." I said nothing, for I could offer no better interpretation. He picked up a faint thread from the grass, a strand of lace, frayed and torn at the edge. "She knelt here," he went on, "of her own will, but not in surrender. There are no signs of violence, no drag marks. She chose this place, Watson. Chose it deliberately." "Then why bring the bell?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. "Surely that is a strange ornament for a suicide." Holmes held up a small object wrapped in a cloth, recently retrieved from the constable on duty. A silver handbell exquisitely wrought, with runic symbols etched around the handle. "Not an ornament," he said. "A relic, possibly ceremonial. This is no household bell. It belongs to an older age." He stood, brushing soil from his knees. "This bell is the key, I suspect, to the door she meant us to open." At that moment, we were approached by a man in a mud-stained coat, carrying a spade over one shoulder. He removed his cap as he neared. "Beg pardon, sirs. Are you the gentleman asking after the Caraway girl?" "We are," Holmes said simply. "And you are the gravedigger who found her?" "Aye, name's Petters. I tend the north side mostly. Found her at dawn, just sittin' there like a statue, pale as milk and quiet as the grave." "Did you see anyone else in the area before then?" Petters scratched his beard. "Strange that, past few nights I seen folks, cloaked, comin' through the back gate. Always around midnight. No lanterns. No noise. Just shadows, slippin' past the tombs like they belonged there." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "How many?" "3. Maybe 4. One of 'em was hummin' low like a prayer or a lullaby. Sent a chill right through me." "Did you speak of this to the police?" Petters shrugged. "They told me to keep my mouth shut. Said it were just superstition. But I tell you, sir, I seen them." Holmes turned to me. "This is no longer merely a question of why Lady Frances died, Watson. It is a question of what she died to expose." He dropped a coin into the gravedigger's palm and thanked him. As we turned back toward the gates, Holmes's face had gone pale, and he looked not at me, but at the bell in his hand. "There is a name for this kind of silence, Watson," he said. "It is called conspiracy." 2 days passed in pursuit of records, parish ledgers, private death notices, and the scant remnants of the Caraway Estate's archives. Holmes labored like a monk in his study, cigarette ash trailing from the bowl beside him, the silver bell ever within arm's reach, as though the object tethered him to the core of the mystery. It was not until the third morning, amid a chill spring drizzle, that a reply came to the note Holmes had sent to Lord Julian Caraway, sole surviving member of that old and scandal-tinged family. A curt invitation was issued to visit him at Caraway House, that once grand residence in Belgravia now withered by neglect and ghosted by servants. As the cab drew up to the black iron gate, Holmes regarded the facade with narrowed eyes. "The decay of stone," he said, "is never so telling as the decay of secrets." We were received by a stooped footman and shown into a drawing room of aged velvet and pale tapestries. At its center stood Lord Julian, tall, severe of brow, and dressed in black despite the hour being far from evening. He neither extended his hand nor offered condolence. "I presume you are Sherlock Holmes," he said, his tone clipped as a paper knife. "And you, Dr. Watson. I remember your name from some business with the late Dr. Roylott. Holmes inclined his head. Your memory serves you well, Lord Carroway. I regret the circumstance under which we meet. I imagine you're here about Frances. We are, yes. Her death, while ruled a suicide, bears marks of something more deliberate, perhaps even staged. Lord Julian gave a small, mirthless smile. You suspect foul play, then? Shall I summon the shade of Moriarty himself to the cemetery gates? Holmes remained impassive. I suspect, my lord, that your sister was involved in matters of some consequence. Ones you would prefer remain undisturbed. At this, Lord Julian's jaw twitched. He walked to the fireplace, lifting a poker, though he made no use of it. Frances was always drawn to things she could not explain. She fancied herself a kind of spiritual cartographer, mapping the unseen. Madness cloaked in philosophy, if you ask me. Did she speak to you of the Order of Ethon? The poker paused in his hand. A beat of silence passed. Then, I had hoped that name had died with our grandfather. Holmes's gaze intensified. Then it is true. It existed. Lord Julian replaced the poker with deliberate slowness. Yes, a secret society, if one believes in such theatrics. Founded by alchemists and natural philosophers during the reign of George II. They dabbled in the soul, Mr. Holmes, in its measurements, its transference, and, God help them, its manipulation. All nonsense, of course, but it infected our family for generations. And Frances, she found their relics in the East Wing Library when she was 16, became obsessed. Read of seances, mirror theory, astral travel, anything that claimed to transcend the mind. He turned toward us, the light casting deep shadows across his face. She believed, you see, that the soul could be split from the self, and that some people, men like you perhaps, were born already divided. Holmes said nothing, though his hands, usually so still, betrayed a twitch at the knuckle. Your sister left behind a diary, Holmes said after a moment. We've yet to locate it. Do you know where she might have hidden it? Julian offered the faintest of shrugs. If it exists, I should not wish to read it. My sister lived half her life in that mirror world of hers, and died kneeling to a ghost. There was a bitterness in his voice, but beneath it, something more, fear. Holmes stepped closer. One last question, my lord. Why was your sister found beside an unmarked grave? At this, Julian Carroway paled ever so slightly. Some mirrors, he said, voice thin, are better left unexamined, Mr. Holmes. I suggest you remember that. And with that, he rang for the footman. As we stepped once more into the rain-streaked streets of Belgravia, Holmes walked in silence for some minutes. When he spoke, it was low and grim. There is blood under that stone, Watson, and not all of it is old. It was near midnight when Holmes returned to Baker Street from his solitary investigation at Highgate. His coat bore the scent of damp earth and withered ivy, and his boots were heavy with mud. I had not seen him since early morning, and I rose from my chair at once. You've been gone the entire day, I said, noting the pallor in his face. Surely you've not been at the cemetery all this time? I have, he replied tersely, removing his gloves with a brisk flick, and I may have uncovered more in that grim acreage of stone than Scotland Yard has in a fortnight of formal inquiry. He threw his overcoat across the chair and withdrew a small object from his pocket, setting it carefully upon the desk. It was a bell, not of brass or pewter, but of silver, small, delicate, with arcane symbols etched into its base. Unlike the church bell from the tower, this one was handcrafted, ceremonial. Holmes spoke as he moved toward the fire. It was concealed beneath the frostbitten roots of a yew, precisely 3 feet from the grave. She buried it herself, no doubt, before ending her life beside it. I examined the bell. The symbols were not familiar to me. Curves and sigils that resembled no language I knew, though one, resembling a flame, caught my eye. Holmes saw my gaze and nodded. The sigil of flame appears in several references to a society calling itself the Order of Ethon, a name drawn from the Greek, meaning blazing. The same emblem was stamped upon a folded page left beneath the altar stone inside the old chapel at Highgate. A cult, then? Holmes shook his head. Not in the vulgar sense. Their existence appears to be philosophical rather than religious. Secretive, of course. Their teachings are riddled with language of self-division, of the mind as mirror, the self as twin. I frowned. And Lady Frances was a member? That is the question, Watson. The evidence is conflicting. The sigils, the bell, and the placement of her body suggest ritual. But the lack of any outward signs of allegiance, no robes, no writings, no witnesses, tells another tale. He paused, then added with uncharacteristic gravity, "What if she was not a follower, but a whistleblower?" The fire crackled in the hearth. I turned to him. "But to expose what precisely?" Holmes narrowed his eyes, and his voice dropped. "There have been other deaths, Watson. Unexplained, unlinked. A woman in Hampstead who spoke of a fractured mirror of the self before leaping into the Thames. A university professor whose last letter refers to the cleft self and its gatekeeper. All dismissed as suicides." He reached for his index file and withdrew a thin folder. Inside were clippings, obituaries, coroner's summaries, personal notes. "They all share one thread," he said, laying them side by side. Each deceased had once corresponded with Lady Frances Carroway. I stared. "You think she was investigating these deaths?" "I think," said Holmes slowly, "that she saw a pattern, and when she tried to reveal it, she was silenced? Or she silenced herself," Holmes replied, eyes distant. "Not out of despair, but as a final cipher. A message. To me." The silence between us grew heavy, interrupted only by the wind brushing at the window panes. "And the yard?" I asked finally. "Gregson is not a fool, but he has neither the taste nor tolerance for abstract motive. He suspects an opium overdose or melancholic fugue." Holmes sighed. "They will close the matter soon. But you will not." Holmes's gaze grew sharp again. "No, Watson, because the bell was meant to toll for me, and I intend to hear it." The Carroway estate in Sussex had long since fallen into disuse and disrepute. Yet when Holmes received a curious card, gilt-edged, and signed, bearing only the phrase, "One does not study the mirror by staring into it, but by becoming its reflection," along with an address for a private gathering at the Carroway Manor, he was roused with something close to excitement. "We are invited," he said, tossing the card upon the table, "to observe lunacy under the guise of intellect." It was a moonless night when we arrived at the estate. The cab stopped a quarter-mile from the gates, as Holmes had instructed. We continued on foot beneath arching yews and the rustle of wet branches. Holmes, dressed in evening attire and carrying an old-fashioned cloak, had disguised his face with subtle but effective waxwork, enough to pass as an anonymous patron of the sciences. "I shall go in as one of them," he whispered. "You, Watson, observe from the perimeter. There is a window to the north side, see what you can see. We must divide our approach." He vanished into the shadowed marble portico, leaving me with the rising mist and the sense that something unnatural hung in the air. From my vantage near the window, I observed a dozen or so figures inside the old hall, gathered in a circle about a glass table. Each wore a silver pendant in the shape of a stylized flame, no doubt the emblem of the Order of Ethon. Holmes stood among them, hands clasped behind his back, his posture straight but alert. A tall figure presided over the gathering. A man with silvered hair, a razor-cut beard, and the bearing of someone accustomed to both reverence and fear. Though his name was not spoken aloud, I recognized him at once from Holmes's files. Dr. Gideon Lorne. Years ago, Holmes had been instrumental in exposing Lorne's manipulation of patients at a private clinic near Hampstead, patients whose personalities had been fractured through suggestion, deprivation, and elaborate ritual. Lorne had vanished before trial, and here he stood, reborn in velvet robes and conviction. "We are not here," Lorne was saying, "to escape the boundaries of the mind, but to step beyond them entirely." Lady Frances understood this. She saw the self not as one but many, a chorus of potential voices. She gave herself freely to the mirror. Holmes, feigning the curiosity of a fellow traveler, spoke in a calm drawl. "And the bell?" "A symbol," Lorne replied. "It marks the moment when the mind is no longer the master, but the vessel." He raised a hand to the crowd. "Some of you have seen it, what we call the cleft self. The state in which perception becomes a looking glass. That is where she went. That is where she waits." I felt a chill, though the wind had ceased. This was not theater for the mad. It was ritual for the intelligent, those seduced by the architecture of their own minds. Then Lorne turned and looked directly at Holmes. "You solved the cases, Mr. Holmes?" he said, his voice sudden as a blade. "But she solved you." A hush fell. Holmes's mask held, but I saw the briefest tightening of the jaw. "I fear I do not follow," he said with polite detachment. Lorne smiled. "Of course not. That is why you're here." With that, he stepped down from his platform and began a slow walk toward a door at the rear of the hall, pausing just before it. "There are truths that cannot be deduced, only endured. Shall we open the next mirror, gentlemen?" He disappeared into the darkness beyond. The gathering began to disperse quietly, their expressions unreadable. Holmes emerged minutes later and met me at the hedgerow. "We must speak, Watson," he said, his voice low and tense. He was not merely playing the crowd. He was speaking to me. "To you? But why?" Holmes stared out at the field, jaw tight. "Because, if his insinuations are true, then Lady Frances did not die seeking knowledge." He paused. "She died trying to teach me something I never wished to learn." The days that followed were marked by a strange withdrawal in Holmes, the like of which I had only witnessed during his darker experiments with cocaine or during the long shadow cast by his duel with Moriarty. He was present, but absent. His hands moved mechanically, his replies were terse, and he paced the sitting room of Baker Street with such ceaseless agitation that even Mrs. Hudson remarked upon it. For myself, I had grown increasingly uneasy. Whatever Holmes had heard from Lorne, and whatever thoughts now crowded his famously ordered mind, they had stirred in him not merely the thrill of pursuit, but something far rarer in that impenetrable soul, doubt. One evening, shortly before midnight, I found him seated in the armchair opposite mine, violin in hand, but unmoving. The fire had burned low, casting the room in flickering gold. The silver bell from Highgate sat on the side table, its runic inscriptions catching the light like whispering voices. "You are not well, Holmes?" I said gently. "You've not eaten, you've not spoken of the case in days. Tell me, what troubles you?" He did not meet my gaze, but drew the bow once across the strings, producing a long, dissonant note. "Watson," he said at last, "have you ever considered whether intellect can become a barrier to understanding? I'm a doctor, Holmes. I trust in what can be proven." "As do I," he said almost bitterly. "Yet I find myself haunted by a woman who asked nothing of me but to see, to truly see, and I find myself incapable of granting even that." He leaned forward and picked up a small leather volume from the floor. Its edges were frayed, its pages yellowed. "I received this today," he said, "from a nameless courier. No note, no origin. But I know whose hand wrote it." He handed it to me. Inside were entries in a fine, slanted script. The Diary of Lady Frances Carroway. March 11th. I observed him again. "Mr. Holmes, a mind like a blade, but one which cuts only away from feeling. His logic is faultless, and yet I pity him. I think he is incomplete, not because he lacks the heart, but because he fears the weight of what it would reveal." March 29th. He saw me, truly saw me, but only as a mechanism of data. What if the human mind, when seen as only a puzzle, cannot be loved? What if love is a logic beyond deduction? I stopped reading. Holmes's voice came from the shadow of his chair, quiet, roughened. "She thought I was fractured, and perhaps she was right." "You were her subject?" I asked slowly. He nodded. "Without my knowledge." We exchanged letters briefly, philosophical queries on identity, nothing of consequence, or so I thought. But she read more from me than I gave. She believed I was missing something, some vital internal alignment, and sought to expose it. Not with cruelty, Watson, but with compassion. The most dangerous method of all. He stood abruptly and went to the window, drawing aside the curtain to stare into the fog-drenched street. I dismissed her, he said. I saw her as clever, curious, yes, but unstable. Now I see she was the only one asking the question I never permitted. Which is? Holmes turned, and for a moment, the firelight caught a look in his eyes that I had never seen before. Something weary, even afraid. Whether deduction without humanity is merely a mirror for madness. I rose, crossing to him. Holmes, you are not mad. You have saved lives. You've unmasked killers, unraveled impossible plots. Yes, he said quietly. But not her. The clock chimed midnight. Holmes turned away from the window and returned to his chair. He picked up the violin again and, after a long silence, played, not a tune of brilliance or drama, but a soft, wandering melody that might have been a lullaby once remembered in a dream. It was then I understood. Holmes had encountered a mystery not of crime, but of conscience. And for once he had no answer. It was a singular and rare thing to witness Holmes brought to such a precipice of his own making. Though I had seen him wounded by bullets and nearly undone by Moriarty's machinations, never had I known him so shaken by the mere memory of another's mind. And yet, it was not Lady Frances's intellect that so disturbed him. It was her insight into his soul, and her final, deliberate silence. As Holmes withdrew further into introspection, I resolved to act on my own initiative, if only to restore some measure of balance. It was not in my nature to meddle with his affairs, but neither could I stand idle while he withered in moral paralysis. I made for the Registry of Lunacy, a bleak and bureaucratic institution tucked behind Fleet Street, where the histories of societies forgotten were quietly bound and shelved. After hours of combing old asylum rosters and family records, I found what Holmes had overlooked, or perhaps refused to seek. A single entry, dated October 15, 1869. Caraway Annabella admitted by husband, Lord Silas Caraway. Diagnosis: hysteria and delusional melancholia. Committed to Briarfield Asylum for Women. No discharge recorded. Deceased, 1887. Burial site: Highgate Cemetery, unmarked, per family request. I stared at the final line, a chill crawling across my shoulders. It was not the grave of a stranger Frances had chosen. It was her mother. I returned to Baker Street that evening to find Holmes seated in silence, the diary open upon his lap, unread. Holmes, I said, handing him the document. The unmarked grave belongs to Annabella Caraway, Frances's mother, committed and erased from public memory by her own husband. That is why Frances knelt there. She wasn't seeking death. She was declaring the truth. Holmes looked at the record, his face unreadable. But when he spoke, his voice held a tremor that belied the stillness of his hands. I see, he said softly. The madness in the family was never hers to bear, yet she bore it nonetheless. He stood and moved to the mantelpiece, staring into the fire. They made her invisible, he murmured. They locked away her blood, shamed it, buried it nameless. And Frances, she made herself the bell, a tolling for remembrance. I nodded. She orchestrated everything, Holmes. The robes, the bell, the mirror language of the order. All of it was theater, not to mislead you, but to ensure you'd investigate. You, of all men, the only one who could uncover the truth with enough clarity that it might be preserved. Holmes turned slowly. And yet, I failed to see her, until too late. You see her now, I said quietly. You see her entirely. He picked up the silver bell from the table and turned it in his fingers. For a long moment he said nothing, and then, she knew me, better than most, perhaps better than I knew myself. And what of Lorne? I asked. He must have known, or at least manipulated some part of this. Oh, he knew, Holmes said grimly, and he used her grief to turn her conviction into spectacle. But he miscalculated. Frances never served his order. She served her mother. And she chose the only medium I would follow without question, mystery. There was something almost reverent in his tone now, as though speaking not of a case, but of a person beloved and lost. And now? I asked. Holmes placed the bell back on the mantel. Now, Watson, he said. We go to tear the order down. We returned to the Carroway estate under cover of darkness. Holmes once again cloaked in the garb of anonymity. This time, however, there was no theater in his manner, no patient analysis nor speculative posturing. He moved with a fixed purpose I had not seen since the days of blackmailers and bohemian clients. The man who had hesitated in the wake of Lady Frances's death had vanished. In his place stood Sherlock Holmes, restored, sharpened, not softened by sorrow. I have secured an invitation of sorts, Holmes said as we crept behind the hedgerow bordering the manor's eastern flank. Our old acquaintance, the Honorable Horace Green, holds a fascination with secret societies and has proved himself a useful facade. I am, for tonight, Lord Bertram Ellesmere, his spiritual protégé. And me? I asked. You, my dear Watson, are the fail-safe. He handed me a sealed envelope, thick and marked with his wax stamp. If I do not return by dawn, deliver this to Inspector Gregson at Scotland Yard. He may not believe every word, but he will believe enough to act. With that, Holmes vanished through the servants' passage, leaving me alone in the black. Inside, he passed unhindered through the parlor and into a long, oak-paneled chamber lit by oil lamps and hung with curious portraits, faces distorted by brushstroke and shadow. At the center stood Dr. Gideon Lorne, robed in black, a medallion of the order hanging low across his chest. You return, Lorne said, smiling like a man who knew both the question and the answer. I was beginning to think even you had limits. Holmes did not smile. I've come for the documents. Lorne's eyes glittered. Which ones? The files you took from Frances Carroway, her notes, her ledger, the ones you keep in the vault beneath this house. The elder man stepped forward slowly, his hands folded. You presume much, Mr. Holmes. I presume nothing, Holmes replied coldly. I know. The cipher in her diary led me here. She documented everything, your experiments, your mirror work, your manipulation of her family's legacy. She wanted the truth exhumed, and I am the shovel. Lorne gave a low, bitter chuckle. And what then? Drag us into the light? The world does not care for the stories of mad girls and invisible graves. She was not mad, Holmes snapped. She was brilliant. She built her death into a message. And you, leech that you are, twisted it into doctrine. For the first time, Lorne's expression faltered. Do you think I corrupted her? He said softly. No, Holmes. I merely opened the door. She chose to walk through it. Holmes's voice dropped. She walked through it to save what you buried. Her mother, her name, her truth. You only watched her descend and called it discovery. Lorne gestured to a panel on the far wall. With a soft groan, it opened to reveal a stairwell spiraling down into darkness. She left them here, Lorne said. All her findings. You may take them, but know this: truth without acceptance is merely noise. Holmes descended without hesitation. Below, in a stone vault lined with shelves, he found dozens of folios, diagrams, and personal records. Some penned by Frances herself, others by her grandfather and father, charting the evolution of the order from mystical curiosity to psychological coercion. The final volume contained a hand-bound ledger, titled in delicate ink, Echoes of the Self, a Theory of Sympathetic Cognition. Holmes turned the final page and saw it. A single line in Frances's hand. He is not incomplete. He is afraid. And still, I forgive him. I met Holmes at the corner of Vauxhall Bridge just before dawn. He emerged from the fog with a satchel beneath one arm and a silence I dared not break. Did you find it? I asked. He nodded. Enough to destroy the order? Holmes's reply came after a long pause. Enough to destroy more than that. The morning after Holmes retrieved the Carroway documents, I expected immediate action. A wire to the Yard, perhaps, or a call upon a magistrate. But instead, Holmes sat at the desk of our Baker Street sitting room, the satchel unopened, his eyes fixed upon the smoldering remains of his third cigarette. "There are names in these papers," he said at last, "that no court would dare utter aloud." I turned from the window. "Then we go to the press." He shook his head grimly. "No editor in London would print it. The Caraway name is woven through the sinews of Parliament, tied by blood and patronage to men who wear the Queen's colors and whisper into the ears of lords. These are not criminals, Watson. They are architects of the very laws they evade. You cannot mean to let it go." He looked at me with weariness more than anger. "I mean only that the path of truth and the path of justice do not always align. If I hand these findings to the Yard, the case will vanish into silence, and I will vanish with it." I recalled then Inspector Gregson's earlier warning. "There are cases, Mr. Holmes, that go above our heads. Tread carefully." Holmes stood and crossed to the fireplace. He retrieved a small envelope from beneath the clock and handed it to me. Inside were 3 names, underlined in red ink. These men funded the order under the guise of medical inquiry. They used Francis's theories to justify private asylum practices, experiments in mental division, forced isolation, cognitive destabilization. Some of their subjects died. Others disappeared. He handed me another slip of paper. "This one, Sir Alton Muirfield, is the man who consigned Francis's mother to Briarfield. The unmarked grave, the sealed records, it was all done to shield his name. He was her cousin." I felt my stomach twist. "So it was blood that silenced her, and blood that buried her," Holmes replied, his voice like flint. "But surely now—" "No," he cut in sharply. "If I act directly, I imperil the case and myself. But I will not leave it buried." He crossed to the window, hands behind his back, the outline of his lean frame silhouetted against the gray morning beyond. "There is another way." "What do you mean?" Holmes turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "The world may not listen to Sherlock Holmes, but it may yet listen to scandal." He explained his plan in swift, precise strokes. A series of anonymous leaks, delivered to radical pamphleteers, the sorts who delighted in pulling threads from the garments of the elite. He would send Francis's diary, edited for clarity but not for force, to a circle of dissident publishers who operated beyond polite society and who had no fear of libel laws or titled names. "But will it be believed?" I asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. "When scandal is dressed in poetry and lined with confession, it does not need to be believed. It only needs to be heard." True to his word, by the end of the week, copies of a new underground tract began appearing in coffee houses, bookstalls, and in the hands of university students across London. Reflections in Silence. The unspoken mind of Lady Frances Caraway spread like fire in dry grass. The effect was immediate. The Order of Ethon, though never publicly named, was quietly dismantled. Its meetings ceased. Properties under its trusteeship were shuttered. The name Caraway, once so proudly associated with lineage, became a whisper of disgrace. As for Dr. Gideon Lorne, he vanished once more, like smoke in a crypt. No trace of him was found in England or the continent. Holmes believed he had slipped through ports under false identity. When I asked if Holmes would pursue him, he simply replied, "He is already lost. Whether he resurfaces is a matter for time, not for me." He did not sound triumphant. He sounded tired, and though the facts had been exposed and the order destroyed, I could not shake the feeling that, in some deeper sense, Holmes counted it a failure. For justice had not been served, it had been redirected. The autumn leaves had begun to curl along the gutters of Baker Street when I found Holmes once more in possession of his violin, not to summon deduction, but to stave off some quiet ache that, even weeks after the affair, refused to recede. He played softly, a meditative strain that never quite resolved. Though the order had been silenced, and their writings discredited through anonymous publication, I knew the weight of the case still hung about him like a fog no sun could burn away. I set down my tea and spoke gently. "She succeeded, Holmes. Francis. She forced their secrets into the light. She made them seen." He lowered the instrument. "Yes, Watson," he said, "but at the cost of her life, and with only the faintest hope of being understood. That, I think, is what haunts me. I regarded him closely. You mean that she died for something no one will fully grasp? She died, he said, for something I failed to grasp. Holmes stood and crossed to the mantel where the silver bell still sat. He had not returned it to Highgate, nor hidden it away. It remained there, a symbol, perhaps, or a relic of penance. He took it in hand now and turned it thoughtfully. You recall what she wrote in the final page of her diary? I nodded. He is not incomplete. He is afraid. And still I forgive him. Holmes gave a faint smile, wry, tinged with sorrow. I have faced down murderers, masterminds, monsters in human guise, he said. But never have I felt so thoroughly seen. And by a woman who, by all accounts, the world dismissed as mad. She wasn't mad, I said firmly. She was ahead of her time. Holmes's eyes met mine then, and for a moment I saw no detachment in them, no clinical distance. Only a man burdened not by ignorance, but by understanding too long delayed. She believed, he said slowly, that I was not broken, only afraid, that the barrier between emotion and intellect was one I had placed there, not one that was born within me. And now I wonder, what might have been had I listened sooner? I had no answer. I only saw, with sudden clarity, the cost of that missed moment, the connection not made, the hand not taken. After a long silence, Holmes returned the bell to the mantel. I shall not pursue another case this month, he said. Perhaps not next month either. You mean to rest? I asked, surprised. No, he replied. I mean to reflect, not upon what I missed in the evidence, but what I missed in her. Frances Carroway was not a puzzle to be solved. She was a truth to be accepted. He turned back toward the fire and added, almost to himself, and I, Watson, have never been adept at acceptance. I said nothing more. For once, silence seemed not a failure of conversation, but a form of respect. Outside, the gas lamps flickered, and the city went about its usual chaos. But within the walls of 221B, something had shifted. Sherlock Holmes had solved many cases, uncovered countless motives, exposed the darkest corners of man's ambition and cruelty. But this was different. He had seen into the soul of another, and, for the first time, permitted another to see into his. It was a fortnight later when I returned to Baker Street to find Holmes in his dressing gown, seated not at the fire nor over his papers, but by the window, gazing through a faint drizzle that softened the city's edge into shadow. You look rested, I said, hanging up my coat. I am, he replied simply. There was no cigarette between his fingers, no violin in hand, just a cup of black tea and an unfamiliar stillness to his manner. For a moment, I almost feared that his faculties had dulled. But then I saw the letters on the table. Precise, crisp, arranged like evidence. He gestured toward them. Reactions, he said, from those who read reflections in silence. I had Mycroft collect the most telling ones. I picked up the first and read aloud. It is a tragic comfort to know that women like Lady Frances Carroway existed, even if the world never truly made room for them. Another read. She saw something the world still refuses to admit, that the mind is more than thought and less than certainty. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. She was not mad, Watson, he said again, more softly this time. She was uncomfortably sane in a world too brittle to accommodate such clarity. I studied him, then ventured, You've changed. He gave a small smile. No, I have widened. He rose and went to the desk. From a locked drawer, he removed the final item recovered from the orders vault. A photograph. I had not seen it before. It showed Frances Carroway, not in her final garb of white mourning, but younger, smiling faintly, seated at a writing desk, a half-filled page before her. Behind her stood her mother, Annabella Carroway, her hand resting lightly upon her daughter's shoulder. She kept this, Holmes murmured. She fought to reclaim it from the ashes of secrecy. It was not science she served, but memory, restoration. He placed the photograph upon the mantel, beside the bell. I watched him for a moment before saying, It is not too late to let the world know you solved this, Holmes. You were right. You were just. He turned to me, gently shaking his head. No, he said. This was never a case to solve. It was a lesson to learn. We stood in silence for a while. Outside, the city rumbled on, oblivious, as ever, to the private reckonings of its greatest detective. At last, he turned to me with something approaching warmth. She forgave me, he said. And so, I must do what I never thought necessary. What's that? He looked into the fire, voice barely above a whisper. Forgive myself. It was some months later, during the late winter, that Holmes and I walked once more through Highgate Cemetery, our coats buttoned high against the chill and our footsteps muffled by the brown, frost-brittled leaves beneath our soles. Holmes carried with him a small parcel, wrapped in oilskin and bound with black ribbon. He said nothing of its contents, and I asked nothing. We walked in companionable silence until we reached the unmarked grave, still untouched, save for a fresh wreath of white lilies laid discreetly upon the stone. Holmes knelt, not as a detective seeking trace evidence, nor as a man burdened with guilt, but simply as one who had come to pay a debt. He removed the parcel's ribbon and unwrapped it. Inside lay the silver bell, polished now, free of soot and soil. He placed it gently upon the grave, just beside the lilies. There, he said softly. Let that be your final signal, Francis. Not a cry for help, but an echo heard. He rose and stood for a moment with his head bowed. As we turned to go, I ventured, You've never recorded this case. No, he said, and I shall not. I nodded. May I? He hesitated, then gave the faintest shrug. If you must, but tell it true. Do not dress it in victory. This was not a tale of crime, it was a mirror. One I nearly refused to look into. I shall be honest, I said, but not cruel. A brief smile crossed his face. You're a kinder man than I, Watson. As we made our way back toward the gates, the mist beginning to lift in gentle filaments across the mossy tombs, I could not help but reflect on the strange shape this case had taken. No villain had been arrested. No applause awaited. The headlines would never trumpet its resolution, nor would the yard acknowledge the quiet dismantling of a sinister order. And yet, it was perhaps Holmes's most important case, because it was not a matter of logic alone, but of recognition. A woman had died not to create mystery, but to reveal truth, and Holmes, in solving her message, had confronted not a killer, but himself. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat with his violin, the bell no longer present on the mantel. He looked toward me and said, without flourish, I may not be complete, Watson, but I am no longer afraid of what is missing. And with that, he drew the bow across the strings, not in melancholy nor distraction, but in something approaching peace. A melody began. It was unfamiliar, but beautiful. And I, for the first time in all our years together, saw Holmes not merely as a man of reason, but as a man who had, at last, come to feel. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows of Sherlock Holmes's most personal mystery. If the story moved you, or made you think, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Was it justice, redemption, or something else entirely? Subscribe for more original literary tales and hidden classics brought to life, and remember, some mysteries are not solved but understood. Until next time, keep your mind sharp and your heart open.